We are looking at questions regarding worship, part of our overall series of being ready to give an answer. These are questions that often come up. Sometimes people want to know, why don't you do something? Why do you do this? Why don't you do that? So that's kind of what this is all centered around. This section that we've been looking at, and we've slowed down a lot on this section because this comes up a lot, questions about worship. And so we've kind of purposely parked here for a little bit because we want to make sure we cover this. We looked last week at some Bible examples that show how not all worship is acceptable. Sometimes people have the idea that if we just throw anything out there toward God and call it worship, that He'll just say, hey, thanks, I really appreciate that. I'm just grateful to get whatever worship I can get or whatever in the name of worship that I can get. But that's not the case. God is very specific. And obviously that makes sense. He is the creator. We are the creation. He is the potter. We are the clay. And so we're to be molded by His will, not the other way around. But we talked about Cain, Nadab and Abihu, Uzziah, all these Old Testament examples of God not accepting their worship because it wasn't offered in accordance with His will. The New Testament Jews in Matthew 15, Jesus made the reference there that they worship in vain, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So good examples there. If someone says, well, I believe just any and all worship is acceptable, we can see from Scripture that it's not. Now, I don't think we actually started on this last week, but what can help us? This should be next in your booklet, right? Okay. What can help us to concentrate or to focus during worship? I think there are a lot of things that we could give. In fact, this is a problem that comes up a lot of times with people that are, they'll say, I'm not, obviously you have some people that get in a situation where there's a heart problem. There's no concern. They don't care about focusing in worship. I think we talked about it last week. It may be, on Facebook. I had a preacher tell me one time, he said, I got to where I don't even look at Facebook on a Sunday afternoon because I got so tired and frustrated of pulling up Facebook on Sunday afternoon and seeing where people had updated status in the middle of the sermon or in the middle of, what would have been the singing or the Lord's Supper or something like that. Obviously sometimes, you're dealing with a situation there where that's not accidental. But a lot of times people ask this question and they say, look, that's a struggle for me. Some people, I know I can personally say for me, I deal with, it's a struggle for me if I'm sitting in, as far as not in the pulpit, obviously it's a little bit different situation there. But if I'm sitting in the pews during worship, I struggle sometimes to pay attention because I have a mind that tends to wander, and I have to really work on that. I have to work on that sometimes sitting at my desk. Sometimes I bounce here and there, and like attention deficit disorder or something. But it's a good question to ask. What can help us to concentrate or to focus during worship? Understanding that not all worship is acceptable to God. I think one thing we can do is remember that we are, we're coming before the throne of Almighty God. That right there ought to drive home and really impress upon us the seriousness of it. It's one thing if you're at a ball game with a friend, or maybe you're sitting in your living room watching the game with a friend, and because you're talking and visiting with one another, and you look up and you go, "What just happened? I don't even know what's going on." And that's one thing. But when we come into the presence of God for the express purpose of worship, and I constantly find myself going, "Wait, what's going on? I'm totally lost here." That's a problem. Now, sometimes that's on us as preachers. I was telling somebody, I can't remember if I mentioned this in my Nicaragua report or not, but I laughed with Reagan about it when we got home from Nicaragua. But one night I was responsible for the count up at the Spanish gospel meeting. It was only in Spanish, so there was no translation. And, so I'm sitting there most of the time. I'm just kind of watching and thinking, man, I really wish I knew what this guy was saying. But so I'm standing there, and and what I've noticed in Nicaragua is people kind of trickle in until about 15 minutes before the service is over. And so if you want an accurate count, you have to stay up there until, at least midway or more through the service. So I'm standing up there, and I'm just listening to the guy, and I catch a word here and there, but, it's like any language. When someone is fluent and native in that language, they're speaking fast. And so even the few vocabulary words I knew, it's hard to pick them out. But at one point, Hainer, my translator, my good friend, standing there with me, and I said it was one of the local preachers from a local congregation in that area who was speaking that night. And so I looked over at Hainer, and I said, obviously I know you can't translate everything he said up to this point, but we're standing at the back, so we're outside the building, and so I can actually talk to him without being a disruption. And I said, I know you can't translate everything he's saying, but what exactly is he talking about like right now? And Hainer looked at me and he goes, honestly, I do not know. And I said, you don't know? And so I thought he's about to confess to me that he's just wandering, not listening to the sermon. And he says, he is, and we'd been laughing during the week about American idioms, expressions that you use that don't mean literally what they say, like it's raining cats and dogs. That's an idiom. And so he said, he looked at me and he said, no, he is, what did you say? He goes everywhere preaching the word. And so we use that expression from Acts 8:4. When I was in preaching school, they used to tell us that. They'd say, get up, and when you have a sermon, have some structure to it so that people can follow, and don't be like the people in Acts 8:4. When they were scattered abroad, they went everywhere preaching the word. He says some people get up and they go everywhere in the text preaching the word, but you can't follow anything that they're saying. And apparently that's what this gentleman was doing. And so Hainer was kind of trying to be nice about it, but he looked at me with this blank stare, and when I asked him what he was talking about, he says, I honestly do not know. Because the guy was just everywhere. He said, in fact, he told me later when we got where we could talk a little bit more, he said, right before you asked, he had talked about marriage, and he said, and then right after you asked, he started talking about baptism. And he said at some point he went into the Old Testament and started talking about different things from the Old Testament. And there was just no structure. So believe me when I say as a preacher, I take very seriously my responsibility to help you as much as I can to pay attention in worship by making a lesson that you can follow and say, okay, and I understand there are very few people, myself included. Sometimes people say, what'd you preach last Sunday? And I just thought, well, let me think. But at the same time, to be able to go home and say, okay, I learned something from that. Here's what we talked about. And I may not be able to recite every single point, but, or someone in the audience may not be able to recite every single point verbatim, but they can say, we had a study today and we talked about whatever, and some general thoughts from that. So some of that is on the preacher or Bible class teacher or whomever it may be. I understand that. But we're talking assuming that here's a person who is, striving and understanding that sometimes people have different preferences. I've heard... I heard a fellow one time, and he kind of was here and there and didn't really have the structure like I would like to hear to be able to help me to follow. But I also understood he was a tremendous speaker, and a lot of people really, really just said, one of my favorite preachers. So some of that is preference. But at the same time, you have to focus in. You can't preach the entire Bible in a single sermon. If you do, then everybody just walks out and says, well, I don't know, something from the Bible, but beyond that. And I've been in the audience sometimes when I left, and somebody could ask me, immediately from my pew to the back door, what was the sermon about today? And I could say, well, it was something from the Bible. And it wasn't necessarily because I wasn't listening, it was because it was just, it was lacking structure. So some of that's incumbent upon us as the preacher, as the teacher, make a lesson that can be followed. And I think you even see this, on the day of Pentecost. We won't go do that now, but you can actually break that sermon down into some major points when Peter is preaching. He talks, the whole sermon is about Jesus. That's the one-word theme. If you want to say a three-word theme, Jesus is Christ. And so he everything he says in Acts chapter 2, leading up to verse 36, it supports that theme. Jesus is Christ. He was prophesied, the miracles, and so on and so forth. And then he uses the resurrection. And so he's basically got 3 or so points there backing up that Jesus is the Christ. And then he works up right up to the conclusion and says, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. And that's when they cry out, what shall we do? And so he preached a sermon. Of course, he's preaching by inspiration, but it's a sermon that people can follow. They know what he's talking about. They can see where he's going. But we need to remember we're coming before God's throne. Is somebody at Revelation 4:10? Okay, go ahead.
The 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created.
All right, here's a scene that John views. Sometimes we say John's looking into heaven. I think I know what we mean when we say that. Just to understand, this is kind of one of those things that you have drilled into your head in preaching school. Brother Cates taught us Revelation, and he used to say, John did not see into heaven. John did not see into heaven. He's seeing a panorama. We might, kind of think of it like an IMAX. He sees this. But obviously, these are not literal images because heaven is a spiritual place, and there aren't these a literal lamb in heaven or literal elders that have these literal crowns on their head. But it's a picture. It's painting a picture for us, symbolic. These 24 elders, they fall down before the throne of God. They worship. They cast their crowns before the throne, as we sometimes sing in our song, casting down their golden crowns around the crystal sea. So the idea there, though, is that they are before the throne of God. Worship puts us into the presence of God. I think a lot of times it's easy to forget that. And sometimes it's something that we do over and over, week in, week out, and it's easy to forget we're coming into the presence of Almighty God. But when we keep that in mind, I think that goes a long way toward helping us retain focus and to remain focused during worship. Another thing is to remember that God sees all and that He is the audience. Sometimes we get so caught up in worship about, I do this sometimes if I'm not careful. You get worried about, am I singing just right? And I'm not a good singing person. I don't know much about music and the right pitch and the right key and all that. And so sometimes you can worry about that, and I bet I sound terrible, or I hope nobody can hear me, or something like that. It's easy to get caught up in something like that and forget that God's the audience, and we ought to sing our hearts out to Him. And I was at Greens Lake Road just recently, a few weeks ago, to give the Nicaragua report because they helped support me to go on that trip. And I remembered, I'd forgotten, I'd not been there in a long time, but there is a man there who has Down syndrome. Chris Reese is his name, and he's the one, I think I've mentioned him here before. Chris, I could always walk in on any given Sunday, Wednesday night, you name it, and I'd say, Chris, when's the next potluck? And he could tell you. In fact, he told me just a couple weeks ago. I asked him something about it, and he knew it right then. He could tell you the exact date. It's going to be Sunday night. Chris loved to eat, and so that made us good friends, obviously. But if you're ever at a service at Greens Lake Road and they're singing, you will hear Chris above everyone. And it may not always be the most on-key, perfectly pitched, but that man is singing with everything he's got for God. He's not singing for you and me to sit there and hope he can impress us with how pretty it is. He's singing to God because he loves the Lord. And I had forgotten that, and when I sat in that assembly, and I remember what a wonderful sound that is to hear this man who he sings with all his heart. And that's what God expects of us. He is the audience. And whether it's leading prayer or participating in prayer or singing, whatever it may be, God is the audience. Preachers, again, can forget this because we get worried about, is the audience going to like my sermon? I hope a lot of people are going to come out and say, that was great. Boy, you did a tremendous job. And sometimes preachers are human. Everybody likes a compliment. But if you're not careful, you get so caught up in that, you forget to preach the word. And sometimes there are sermons that if you preach it right and you preach it scripturally, people aren't going to come out and say, boy, I really enjoyed that sermon. Sometimes it's going to be quite the opposite. It may not be that they're upset, but there are hard-hitting sermons. If something is wrong with someone, if there's a sermon on hell, and people come out and say, great sermon, or not necessarily if they say great sermon, but if they say, I really enjoyed that, something's wrong if you enjoy a sermon on hell. But at the same time, we understand that's biblical and it's needed. There's a lot of teaching in the Bible on hell as motivation for us to stay away from it and understand we don't have to be lost in hell. So remember God as the audience. I think a lot of our problems focus and getting off track in worship would be solved if we would remember that God is the audience and He sees everything. Remember, not all worship is acceptable. We talked about that last week. God's never promised just to accept whatever. I think that's also a motivating factor. Remember that God is disgusted by a lack of reverence in worship. Let's go to Malachi. Malachi chapter 1. You talk about some hard-hitting preaching coming from Brother Malachi here. This was certainly not a sermon that the people are going to come out and say, boy, I really enjoyed that. I preached a sermon one time. It was on apathy, and actually, it was a long story leading up to it, but it was kind of an impromptu. I'd actually studied and prepared that evening to preach a different sermon, but there was such a problem in the congregation with apathy. This was several years ago in a church that one of the first full-time works I ever did, but there was such apathy, and it was on my mind and weighing on me all afternoon, and so I got up Sunday night to preach, and I went to make a remark about something from Sunday morning, and I kind of just kept talking about it, and it just turned into a sermon on apathy, and I ended up in Malachi chapter 1. But I'll never forget, there was a little old lady. She was about 88, I believe, and her name was Miss Duva. And she came out, Duva Carter. And Miss Duva came out, and I'm standing at the back, and people are coming by, and I mean, some people were not even hiding the disgust, the frustration, whatever you want to call it, anger. And Miss Duva came by, and she could be pretty plain spoken, and so I didn't know what I was going to get from Miss Duva. But she came by, and I'll never forget it. She pointed her finger at me, and she said, "Preacher," she always called me preacher. "Preacher, you gave us a good whooping today." I said, "Okay." And she said, "But we needed it. Sometimes you need a good whooping." And I said, "Well, I guess that's true, Miss Dew." And she just walked on out, and that was all she had to say. She wasn't criticizing. She just said, "You know what? That was a hard-hitting sermon," but she understood it was needed. And sometimes it is. Sometimes, you think about how many times in life you can get in a rut, and the only thing that gets you out of it sometimes is to get shaken up a little bit. I've told before, Brother Mosier had a fellow he was studying the Bible with one time, and this fellow was very near obeying the gospel and got very angry, and Brother Mosier said he actually picked up a lamp and threatened him and said, "You get out of my house now." And as only Brother Mosier can, he says, "Oh, now don't do this." So-and-so, he called him by name. He says, "Don't do this." He says, "I mean it, get out. I don't want you in my house." And he says, you're narrow-minded and all this. And he says, don't do this, because you're just going to end up waking me up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'm going to have to come out here, and I'm going to have to meet you at the building and baptize you in the middle of the night. Why don't you just settle down right now and let's talk about this? Get out. And he said, "Well, I was wrong. It was about 4 when he called, and he said, I know what I need to do." But what it was, he got angry because he's wrestling with something that he didn't want to have to deal with. And sometimes you have to shake people up a little bit. Malachi 1, verse 6, beginning, Malachi is going to shake them up a little bit. Of course, this is God speaking through Malachi. A son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I, God speaking here through Malachi, if then I be a father, where is mine honor? And if I be a master, where's my fear? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name. Now, who are God's priests today? Christians. A holy priesthood, right? 1 Peter chapter 2. And so, we could just easily say this is something that we need to take to heart. Goes on, and you say, wherein have we despised thy name? What have we done? Verse 7, he tells them, you offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and you say, wherein have we polluted thee? In that you say the table of the Lord is contemptible. The table of the Lord is contemptible to them. And if you offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And if you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? Oh, you got a sick lamb in your flock? Save that one for the sacrifice. We won't miss it. Brother, I think it was Franklin Camp maybe, wrote an article years ago. He talked about this tribe of natives in some, I think it was somewhere in the South Pacific or something, but they had a very, very interesting ritual. They would take a pig and slaughter a pig, and they used everything for some purpose, whether food or some other purpose, except one piece of the pig did not get used. And you know what it was? The pigtail. And you know what they did with the pigtail? They offered it to their God. And he went on in the article and he talked about pigtail religion. People take their lives and they use every little bit that they can, and sometimes they're very frugal with this and very frugal with that, and I'm gonna make sure I don't waste anything. But if there's one thing left that I can't use, one little bit of time, one little bit of resources, and then I'll give that to God. And that's what these people are doing here in Malachi chapter 1. He says, why don't you try offering that to your governor? See what he has to say about that. And it's a rhetorical question because they knew good and well the governor would not accept it. In fact, he'd be very angry. He goes on, drop down to verse 10. Who is there even among you that would shut the doors for naught? Neither do you kindle fire on mine altar for naught. I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts. Neither will I accept an offering at your hand. If somebody ever gets to thinking, well, God just ought to be happy with whatever he gets, go read Malachi 1:10. God says to these people very clearly, I'm not accepting an offering from you because your heart's not right. Your heart's not in it. And in fact, he says you might as well just shut the doors. Might as well just shut the thing down. Goes on, verse 11, from the rising of the sun, even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles, and in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering, for my name shall be great among the heathen, saith the Lord of hosts. I'd finished not that long ago the book of Ezekiel in my daily reading, and over again, God tells this nation what's going to happen to them. And so many times, I wish I didn't think about it until I was more than halfway through the book. I wish I'd have thought to just count throughout that book how many times he says, and you shall know that I am the Lord. God says to these people here, this is after the exile. They're not worshiping idols here, but they're just very lackadaisical, empty-hearted, no heart in it whatsoever with their worship. And God says, my name is going to be great. My name shall be feared one way or the other. But he's not accepting their worship. He goes on, 12. Ye have profaned it in that you say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. Ye said also, behold, what a weariness is it. You know what that translates to in our day and age? Do I have to? Sometimes anything. Whether you're talking attendance, whether you're talking giving financially, whether you're talking giving energy, anything. And sometimes just the first question that comes out is, do I have to? That's this mentality. What a weariness is it? Instead of saying, what can we do for the Lord? We get to come into his presence. And he goes on and says, you've snuffed at it, saith the Lord of hosts. Now, it's kind of the scoffing type, just Sneer, yeah, that's what some translations have. That's a excellent translation of more in line with what we would say. Sneer at it. He goes on and says, you brought that which was torn and the lame and the sick. Thus you brought an offering. Should I accept this of your hand, saith the Lord? Watch what he says in 14. But cursed be the deceiver which hath in his flock a male, and voweth and sacrificeth unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen. That's like that word terrible we talked about before in a Q&A session. The idea of awesome, awe-inspiring. Anybody got a New King James or something else have a different word there? Feared. My name is to be feared among the heathen. Reverence, respect, understanding who he is. I don't know of a much better passage to go to talk about a lack of reverence in worship and a lack of just completely lacking in heart in their worship than Malachi chapter 1. We need to remember that when we come before God to worship, and that certainly should help us to concentrate and to focus during worship. Another thing we could say that would help us is to prepare beforehand. Be as rested as possible. This is sometimes difficult to do. It may be little ones. It may be sickness. It may just be have trouble sleeping. But as much as possible, as much as is in you, do that. Sometimes when I was younger, some of us we were not doing anything bad, anything immoral or ungodly or wrong, but sometimes we just stay up so late, and then that'd be Saturday night, and then Sunday morning, you just find yourself, your head just bobbing all over the place, like, I just can't hold my head up. Well, I guess not. So sometimes, even though you'd say, and sometimes that was kind of the thing people would say, well, we're not doing anything wrong. We're just staying up talking, visiting. Well, that's fine. But if you're so tired that you can't even hold your head up to worship God, you got to ask yourself, what's more important, hanging out with friends or coming into the presence of God and being able to pay attention? Be as rested as possible. And I understand that there are things going on. That's not to say that you got to be in bed at 8 or 9 o'clock, but we understand. We know what we have to be able to function and to be able to pay attention. Avoid sitting where you'll be distracted. These two really are just common sense, but I think they sometimes get overlooked. There are certain people to this day that I can't sit beside. I've got buddies that, and I've even told them, and they've told me the same thing. We don't see each other very much, and if we see each other, we get somewhere and maybe it's PTP or maybe it's a lectureship, we can't sit beside each other because I guess it's maybe because we don't see each other that much, you just want to cut up, you want to talk, but we understand that's not the time for it. And so, sometimes people say, I was trying to pay attention, but so-and-so kept talking to me, kept passing me a note, kept doing this, kept doing that. Simple solution, don't sit by so-and-so, So that happened sometimes when I was younger too. And I remember a couple of times when I was young being mandatory relocation, as in mom and dad come and say, you're not sitting by that person anymore. I heard, it happened before I came. The church I worked with in Illinois, there was a family, their daughter was goofing off and she was cutting up and they were passing notes and playing around or whatever. And her dad got up in the middle of worship. I wish I could have seen it. It would have probably been really awkward though, so maybe it's better that I didn't. But he got up in the middle of service. I think they said she was 14 or 15 years old. He got her by the ear. Isn't that awesome? He got her by the ear and he walked her back and sat her between him and his wife. And they said she was just 3 shades of red and so embarrassed. And after I came, she told me about it. She was a little older by the time I came there, but somehow we got talking about getting in trouble in worship when we were kids. And she told me about that, and I said, that is one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. I said, I always kind of feared that might happen to me, but it never went that far. But she said, oh yeah, it happened. Oh, yeah, she said she never, I mean, like, even when she got a little bit older and some of the older folks would say, well, you want to come up here and sit with some of us? And she's like, no, I think I'm good right here. That's like, I think it was Jerry Clower that told the story about stealing the cookies from Mama, the tea cakes. And she had set them out on the window for somebody, and he came up and just reached up there and got 2 or 3 of them and thought she didn't know, and she tore them up so bad. He says, to this day, before I ate a tea cake, I call Mama. I think that's kind of how that young lady was. But, you know, those are lessons that you don't forget, though, and it helps, as a parent, it helps drive home to a child the seriousness of worship. And so, you know, if you know you're sitting by somebody and it's going to be a distraction, and hey, let's be honest, it can happen as adults. There can be somebody that I know we're going to be a distraction to each other. Like I said, I'm grown now, but I've got that friend that it's a temptation because we don't see each other very much, and we may want to talk about something, or we have very similar sense of humor, so something may strike him as funny and it strikes me as funny. Well, then we're distracting each other because we're tickled about something. So we just know, you know, sit beside each other. So these are just common sense things, but, you know, the main things here, you got to remember the whole point of worship that we talked about up to this point. God is the audience. We're coming before his throne to worship him. He sees everything. He is the one we've got to worry about. Does he like it? Does he not like it? Is he accepting it? Is he not accepting it? And we've got to remember that he's not going to just accept any old thing. And he is very disgusted by a lack of reverence. So many times, and really it's troubling to see a lot of folks, sometimes even within the Lord's church, treat worship, I mean even church leaders in some cases, preachers and elders and deacons, treating worship like it's such a frivolous thing and turn it into some kind of a show or entertainment-driven type thing. And you know, go to Malachi 1 and see how disgusted God is by that lack of reverence in worship. And prepare beforehand. Make sure you're prepared. That'll help in worship. Why doesn't the Church of Christ, next question here, why doesn't the Church of Christ use mechanical instruments of music? We could really spend a lot of time on this one. We're going to hit some high points. If there are further questions, by all means, I want you to tell me and let me know so that we can. That's not in there. Oh, okay. Well, we'll get to that next one too. You may want to add an extra one. I got another question that I knew was not in there. For some reason, I was thinking this one was. But you can't talk about worship without this, right? Because people can come and visit the Church of Christ, and you know, they could talk about the wonderful people we have. You know, especially here at Bremen, they could talk about the wonderful people, and you know, we have great singing here. They could talk about the great singing. They could talk about this. They could talk about that. But you know, and I know, 99 times out of 100, the first thing somebody says, "Where's the piano? Where's the organ?" And yeah, sometimes it's, you know, well, oh, bless your heart. You know, y'all need to take up a collection or something? Is it a financial thing? You can't afford it? Sometimes, you know, it's just a question people have. And I mean, it just never fails. You take a visitor, especially first time, and they just kind of go, whoa, time out. I mean, no drums, there's no organ, there's no piano. Are they back there somewhere? I see there's some space back there. You know, and it's just, people have that question. It's a valid question. So don't shy away from it. I think it's a good chance to begin to study the Bible with someone and to talk about some of these things pertaining to worship and other things. Yes, sir.
Sometimes I'll hear the phrase from a person, a denominational person, "Oh, y'all are the ones that don't use music, do you?"
Yeah.
I end up taking advantage of that and say, "Yes, we do. We sing a cappella."
Yes, and I say the same thing, because sometimes people will say that. They'll say, oh, that's right, I forgot, y'all don't have music in the Church of Christ. I say, that's not true. We absolutely have music. Oh, is that? I guess some things have changed. I said, oh no, the church has always had music. Now, we don't have mechanical instruments of music, but I said we have, on any given Sunday morning, 180, 200, sometimes more people, that blend their voices together and sing with all they got to the Lord. And it's beautiful, wonderful music. It's just not mechanical. It's people singing with their voices. It's God-given instruments. So, yeah, that's a good point, is that it's not that we don't have music, just not mechanical instruments of music. Now, why does the Church of Christ not use mechanical instruments of music? Well, some people would say it's just a tradition. That's their tradition. And in fact, I've even heard people say, hey, that's your tradition. I respect that. Our tradition is different, but that's your tradition. Time out. Nothing is my tradition or your tradition, at least when it comes to how we worship God. Now, we understand there are some traditions that are neither here nor there. Do we meet at 6 o'clock Sunday evening? Do we meet at 5 o'clock? Do we have an afternoon service? Do we even have an evening service on Sunday evening? All that is in the realm of tradition, and it could go either way. It doesn't matter. But when you talk about how we worship God, how we fulfill God's command to worship, then, yeah, it's not just a matter of tradition. We got to go to the Bible and see what does the Bible say. Some people say, hey, look, y'all don't like instruments? I'm okay with that. That's cool, man. Y'all go ahead and sing a cappella, and we'll sing with our instruments. That's okay. It's not just some people like it, some people don't. It's not just a desire to be different either. Some people act like, well, it's just, those Church of Christ folks, they like to be different. And so they don't use an instrument. I've even heard some brethren say stuff like this. Well, my brethren, we just got to be different. That's not a reason to do anything pertaining to worship or the Bible or spirituality, just to be different. So it's none of that. The whole issue centers around authority. You see now again why I say when you get somebody into a Bible study, you better study authority first. Because when I understand that what Jesus says goes and that there is a way to ascertain his authority and to determine what he has bound, what he has loosed, where we have freedom, where we don't, when we understand that, then any question, it's next in our book. I'm not going to go ahead to that just yet, but if somebody says, well, I noticed you don't have women leading. Why is that? You got to start with authority. It centers around authority. Because if it's just popular vote, then guess what? Everybody's using the instrument. Now, FYI, the church is not, the Lord's church is not the only group that does not use the instrument. There are primitive Baptists that still don't use the instrument. The Greek Orthodox Church has not used the instrument for centuries. In fact, when the instrument was introduced several centuries after Christ, after the church began, it split the church. And what is now the Orthodox Church, they said, no, this isn't right. Completely unauthorized, and we're not going for it. And so it split the Catholic Church. And so you have the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church to this day does not use the instrument. But the point is, the vast majority of folks in so-called Christendom, they use instrument. And so it's not a matter of just, well, what is everybody else doing? It's not a matter of just, well, what do we want? It centers around authority. Jesus has all authority. Matthew 28:18. Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, all power, or Greek is exousia, authority. All authority is given unto me in heaven and on earth. So Jesus has all authority. Colossians 3:17. We sing it we have a song in our songbooks. Whatsoever you do, word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God and the Father by him. And you've heard the illustration before. If a policeman says stop in the name of the law, we know what that means, by the authority of. There's no authority for mechanical instruments of music in New Testament worship. I want us to turn to 2 Chronicles 29. Sometimes, in fact, I've done it before, going to Amos chapter 6 and talking about where it says, woe to them that do this, that, and that invent to themselves instruments of music like David. And I say, I don't think God ever intended for them to use the instrument even in the Old Testament. But number one, that's using that verse out of context, as I learned later on. That verse is not saying woe to people who invent an instrument like David. It's saying, woe to the people that are just, and the southern expression might be just kind of, he's talking about people who are just sprawled out. They're lazy. They're very kind of similar to what we saw in Malachi 1, different time, different group of people, but very just lackadaisical in spirituality, not giving any attention whatsoever to how to follow God as he would have them to or to please him. But also, because 2 Chronicles 29, you'll see there is, it seems to me, very clear authority under the old covenant for the use of the instrument. Who's got it? 29:25.
And he set the Levites in the house of Jehovah with cymbals, with psalteries, and with harps, according to the commandment of David, and of Gad the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet, for the commandment was of Jehovah by his prophets.
All right, did you catch that? The commandment was of the Lord or Jehovah. This was his commandment. When I first came across this and started studying it, I thought, I don't know this. In fact, I've even heard people say, well, how do you deal with this when you get over to the New Testament and you start trying to oppose it? I think it makes it clearer than ever, folks. God was okay with the instrument under the old covenant, so guess what? He expressly authorized it. Get your pen out and I'll give you an exhaustive list of every verse in the New Testament authorizing the use of mechanical instruments of music.
Won't take long, will it?
Won't take long at all. Bob, you were going to say something.
One of the best debates on that was, I think it's 4E Wallace, and he had a chalkboard up there, and he listed each night the passages in the New Testament that authorized playing instruments. And he asked his guy to keep, listing the points, and by the time the end of the debate happened, that was the whole point. There were no verses in the New Testament. But everybody thought they were there at the beginning of the
That's
debate.
right.
Boy, let me tell you.
And I've preached on this particular question before, and sometimes I'll point out every verse in the New Testament that mentions singing, period. There's only, I'm trying to remember the exact count, it's either 10 or 12. 10 or 12 verses in the entire New Testament. Never once do you find an instrument authorized or mentioned there, other than the instrument that God gave you, your voice. Yes, sir.
If an individual gets out in public and has this discussion very much, they will run across someone that will try to give the authority of Psalms 150 to make the claim that there is the authority. But obviously, different time dispensation, we're not under that authority anymore. But yes, Psalms 150, if that discussion's had enough times, it will come up.
Oh, yeah. And I've run across that too. But yeah, part of the old law. And God authorized it under that law. And so they absolutely had every right to use those instruments because they were authorized. And it's the same reason that we don't use them under the new covenant, because they are not authorized. And so just, bear that in mind. God did authorize them in the Old Testament, but no authority for it under the new covenant. Sometimes I just, again, this is going to be very quickly, but there are some major arguments that people will use. And I think it'd be good for you to jot, at least just a quick note in your booklet, some arguments that people will use. And I'm not even saying argument in the sense of trying to be argumentative. Sometimes people are just saying, I want to be right, and so let me think this through. And so as they're thinking it through, they may say something like, well, look, the Bible doesn't say not to, right? But Hebrews 7:14 says it's evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, from which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. The Hebrews writer's making the point the priesthood has changed because Jesus is from Judah. Priests under the law of Moses were from Levi. He can't be a priest under the law of Moses. Changing of the priesthood means the changing of the law. But Moses spake nothing about Judah. He never said the tribe of Judah could not be a priest. If you take your car to a repair shop and you tell them, hey, could you change the oil and rotate the tires for me? And you come back and they've got this bill, $2,000. They rotated the tires, they changed the oil. Well, look, we redid your brakes, we replaced this, we replaced that, and you start saying, time out. I'm not paying for all that. I didn't tell you to do all that. Well, you didn't tell us not to. We understand in real life that doesn't work. So That's what sometimes people say. We need to understand we're governed by what God says, not by what he does not say. All right, let me pull these up real quick, and I'll probably review them next week just to be sure, but I want you to be able to get them in your notebook. Sometimes people say they were used in the Old Testament. Well, he taketh away the old that he may establish the new. Hebrews 10:9, we already talked about that. Sometimes people say it sounds so much better. But that begs the question, better to whom? That gets back to who the authority is. Who is the standard? Who is the audience? And by the way, it's debatable. That's a subjective statement to say it sounds better, because I've also talked to other people who say, oh, no, a cappella sounds way better. That's a matter of opinion. But what's not opinion is what does the Bible say about it? Solo, sometimes people say in Ephesians 5:19 authorizes the instrument, but the only instrument authorized there is given to you right in the text, and it is your heart. And you know what's beautiful about that? If you are deaf and dumb, guess what? You can still sing to God from the heart. So the only instrument authorized is given right there, and it is the heart. We'll unpack that one a little bit further next week, because that's the one that really people really try to drive home. But I wanted to get those up so you get them in your notebook. We'll talk about them a little bit further next week. Thank